So let me share with you the document for this morning, and we'll begin our prayer, which will seem obvious to all of you. So we begin as always, Benum Christ in it. So, yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me. Thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me. Amen. That has been, for obvious reasons, a real prayer that's been close to my heart in the last weeks. So I share it with you today. So the first reading that we have for today comes from, for those of you who have the book, will come from page 8. We're plodding right along. And it comes from the middle of the page. Today, the fascination with so-called mystical experience is no doubt influenced by an increasingly therapeutic culture prevalent throughout much of Western secular society. Reflective of this, popular forms of meditation often center around personal health benefits, pain management, stress reduction, improved concentration, professional success, or better sleep habits. All of these are touchstones or entry points into the practice of meditation. For example, mindfulness draws on the fundamental principles of meditation that lie at the foundation of most all traditional forms of practice: deep breathing, good posture, the cultivation of silence, and interior attentiveness. These skills are all but universally recognized as the foundational components of meditation that different faith traditions have various built upon. So we'll move into our meditation for a bit, and then follow up with the next paragraph, and of course then move into our conversation following. So our second reading this morning is also from page 8. Traditionally, Christian contemplative practice has not emphasized meditation as a method of self-improvement, but more so of self-forgetfulness. It has been less about what one experiences during prayer and more about how one is transformed through prayer. In other words, spiritual growth is not measured by the extent to which one experiences mystical phenomena or personal health benefits, but by the extent to which one increasingly reflects the image of God, or the Imago Dei, in the world. So there's a few comments I'd like to make about those as we maybe open up to conversation first, our closing prayer. This is a prayer, by the way, that I wrote, I was asked to write for what I think is the upcoming Contemplative Outreach December Bulletin, which some of you may subscribe to. So you'll see this again if so. So it's entitled God's Pilgrimage. O God, in this season of darkness and shadow, when our greater light is slow to rise and shadows quick to fall, may we, like Magi, pilgrim toward an inner epiphany of Christ, carrying the gifts of an open heart, a welcoming heart, a consenting heart. To you, O God, whose heart is restless until you rest in us. Overshadow us now with the same Spirit that hovered over Mary, by whose consent you poured yourself into creation, a self-emptying which human minds could not imagine nor hearts conceive. We pray then, in the silence of your word made flesh, we may conceive in ourselves the inconceivable that we may with Mary offer our yes, our fiat, that we may never cease to birth Christ in the world, never cease to embody Christ in ourselves as words made flesh. Break upon the muck of human history in the Bethlehem of our own hearts, where amidst our doubt and fears we may discover yet again the breaking of a new dawn, where we may discover yet again eternity birthed in time and hope born in the most unexpected of places. For alas, a new dawn breaks upon us, and indeed within us, not with the ferocity of a divine warrior, but with the vulnerability of an infant Messiah, in whom we discover at last our pilgrimage to God is but God's pilgrimage into every living soul. Amen. Okay. There we go. Several years ago, I was invited to give a presentation at a yogi ashram on Paradise Island in the Bahamas. A professional visit to be sure, but none which any of my colleagues were seeing any reason to complain about. And they had run a series of speakers from different religious traditions and basically asked the question, what is enlightenment out of the perspective of your particular tradition? So I had the joy of really spending several days, not only with the Swami at whose table we sat to have dinner every night, all of the speakers, but also with a rabbi and Sufi master. And we all sort of engaged in these wonderful dialogues over the course of our meals. But at one point I asked the Swami if it bothered him that I could go to my local gym and take what is called a yoga class, which has virtually nothing really to do with the deep meditative body work and practice that they were teaching the members of their particular ashram. And I expected him to say something like, yeah, this is an aberration and it's terrible and it's so watered down that it's barely even touching upon the reality. But he surprised me because he said, no, he said, I'm happy for those things because for many, many yoga practitioners, that gym class became the first step towards something much, much deeper. It was an entry point into a spiritual practice that began as sort of just a stretching and breathing exercise in a gym, but actually opened the way for something much deeper. And I never forgot that. And as I was writing these particular paragraphs, that conversation came back to me. Because I recognize in sort of the proliferation of mindfulness practice, a real effort and an attempt for people to move into a deeper spiritual practice. And while I do sense that there are some limitations around how mindfulness is being sort of promulgated, mostly in the ways that I describe in that first paragraph, it becomes more about self-help than self-forgetfulness, to use a quick turn of phrase. It nevertheless does provide, I think, an entry point and a first step towards something deeper. But I did want to distinguish it from what it is I'm talking about throughout this book, which really is that deeper movement towards self-forgetfulness. And because of that, the question that I try to raise in these paragraphs as we move forward is where we place our sense of progress, if one can or should even rightfully do that in meditation. And what I'm trying to help you to consider is whether you wouldn't look at the progress of your meditation, not within the practice, as would a self-help sort of assessment, oh, I'm sleeping better, or I'm less stressed out, but more around the lines to which you begin to discern not what's happening in the practice itself, but how there's transformation and grace outside of the practice. In other words, how much more you begin to recognize, even in small increments, a sense in which you're embodying Christ in the world in a more profound or deeper or consistent way. And in many ways, that's what I was trying to begin to get out with these paragraphs. So I just wanted to kind of provide a little background for you along that, and then see what questions, pragmatic or otherwise, might be surfacing for you all.
Well, Vincent, thank you for your positive comments. Until recently, or I would say until now, I've been seeing mindfulness as just a process or principle in itself. And comments I received from friends who are Buddhists, some of them feel really appalled that the principles of that practice have been taken away from the doctrine, the principles, the philosophy of Buddhism as a tradition. And I could understand what they felt, and I could concur with their point of view. I saw the effect of that on people in terms of in self-improvement, but people tend to gravitate around their own self. To a certain point, I would say their own ego, and not moving forward. So your comment, your view, and also what you expressed in this paragraph gave me a different nuance, and brought to my memory that passage in the Revelation when Christ says he's knocking on the door and waiting. If they open the door, then he will come and dine with them. Mm-hmm. So I believe would be along those lines. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Dwight. To some degree, I do struggle with aspects of so-called mindfulness, and I would share to some degree the concerns that your Buddhist friends have shared with you, this sort of distillation of certain practices apart from the doctrine, the history, the context, and so forth. I do think that there's some merit in that concern. My thought is, if everybody in the world were practicing mindfulness as such, we'd all probably be in a better place. And so there's a certain degree to which I think the practices themselves, as even in their distilled form, are a knocking on the door, to use your term, right, into that. But one can hardly escape the tendency, and maybe this is me just coming out of more of an American culture, it may be different in some of your own cultural contexts, that mindfulness does in the literature and so forth tend toward a self-helpy kind of emphasis. And there's nothing wrong, on the other hand, with self-help. But like the Swami would have instructed me in our conversation, I think that is a first step is a knocking on the door, to use your term, but to cross the threshold, to walk into the portal of what I think both Buddhist and Christian meditation are, and probably one could argue most of the noble meditative traditions around the world are calling us to something more than what mindfulness seems to have been reduced to. So that's where I'm coming from in the paragraph, and wanting folks to understand that very often the contemplative is one who doesn't necessarily find there's that beautiful line in Paul where he is begging God, Christ in the sense, to remove the quote unquote thorn in his side. He doesn't ever indicate what he means by that thorn, whether it's some flaw he perceives in himself, or some doubt he holds, or whatever it is, he keeps asking for it to be removed. And as many of you know, the response is, my grace is enough for you. And I think there's contemplative wisdom out of the Christian tradition in that, in that the thorns in our sides very much can persist, so that we don't necessarily develop self-help improvements in our nature, but learn how to live with them as imperfections, and that we shouldn't therefore measure our meditative practice by the degree of personal flaws getting fixed, but rather the extent to which grace is operative in and through and despite them. So that the movement is to forget who we are, to forget ourselves, not to emphasize on all of our imperfections and flaws, but to know that grace can and will be and is operative despite all of those things, and in and through all of those things, in what in my prayer I call sort of the muck of life. And then we can begin to notice, oh, well, outside my meditation, I'm beginning to observe moments of tranquility or peace or grace or non-reactiveness and so forth that signify grace at work, the image of God becoming more apparent in me, rather than how perfect my actual meditation session in itself was.
Thank you.
Yeah, sure.
When we offer the introductory workshop to centering prayer, the fourth talk is precisely about the fruits of centering prayer and how they are experienced in everyday life and not as part of the prayer, etc. In other words, it's in the small details of everyday life when at one point we may be able to be more generous or more forgiving, etc., etc. But I think that this way of looking at Christian contemplation, which is very much in the spirit of kenosis, of letting go, and not of acquiring things, is very countercultural. And that's why it's so difficult to get, even for those of us who practice forms of Christian meditation, like centering prayer in my case. We're always trying, at first at least, to see what we are getting, what we are obtaining, even in the form of virtue, getting, rather than just forgetting ourselves, as you say, letting God take over, and not worry whether our brains are changing and whether I'm being more healthier. I mean, if that happens, that's fantastic, that's great, but that's not it. To get to that point takes an awful lot of grace and an awful lot of time also. Mm-hmm. It reminds me of when the little flower sister Celine, Saint Therese of Lisieux's sister Celine, went to her because she had been very impatient with another nun and so on. And she says, oh, how much more virtue I have to get. And Therese said, how much you still have to let go of. In other words, there were the two approaches. And our religious approach many times has been getting, doing, acquiring merit and things like that, rather than letting go. So I think it's understandable that we don't get it, especially at the beginning.
That's right. Thanks, Isabel. That's very helpful. I'll address that whole concept of it's been attributed to Meister Eckhart, who says precisely that spirituality is more about subtraction than addition. And I may have mentioned that before. And this, I think, is getting to the same point of Therese, as you're saying. And it is countercultural. I like your the way you said, it's less about getting than forgetting. That's precisely what I'm trying to say in these paragraphs that I read today. And it is as much in the spiritual life, it is rarely a linear progress that we make in that area. There's always the ebb and flow. I'm so struggling right now in my life with the ebb and flow of grief and what that begins to look like and how that informs and shapes me. But I think that is really metaphorical for the whole of the spiritual life, which is, I think, rarely, if ever, linear, and much more circular and ebb and flow and give and take and wandering, sort of as Israel through the desert with no clear direction, but somehow in the meta journey getting to where we need to go. So thank you for that.
Yeah. Out of curiosity, that ashram that you spoke about in the Bahamas, was that the Shivananda ashram?
It was, yes. Have you been?
No, I have not, but I'm familiar with the practice because I'm a certified Shivananda yoga instructor.
Oh, nice, wonderful. Yeah, it was a wonderful experience to be there. And the youth and the vitality of the people, young kids from all over the world who were there to really take this. And it was a serious life. I mean, they were up early, they were doing physical labor to keep the ashram going, and they were really committed to their spiritual lives. So I got to meet young folks from all over the world who were just spiritually thirsty and curious, and it was a wonderful experience, a beautiful place.
Well, perhaps I'll visit there one day.
Yeah, Martha, you would love it. And their chanting is beautiful too.
Yes. And interesting with regards to mindfulness, jokingly, I sometimes say, well, science is catching up with faith or religion. I think within the past 30 years or so, because the benefits of, for lack of a better word, of contemplative lifestyle, meditation in particular, science can now validate. It's become more mainstream because of the health advantages, psychological advantages in helping people feel better, which is a plus. I agree with that as well. But I also think, yes, that it can be a doorway because simply of the quiet, as we know, to look deeper within to embrace a spiritual practice. So yes, has the practice been watered down a bit, secularized a bit? Yes, most definitely. But can there be a benefit to that in the long run where people will turn inward and start to seek a spiritual practice in their particular tradition? Yes, that's also a definite possibility. So then, therefore, spirit, mind, and body will completely be transformed and healed. And so I find it very, very interesting because, yeah, there's many ways to look at what's happened in mindfulness and in contemplative practices.
For sure. Well, and I think we're moving to a place where we even have to reimagine what science and its purpose is. We have something I started here a couple of years back called the Iona Lectures after the island of Iona, the monastery of Iona, which served as both an intellectual and contemplative center in Western Europe under the tutelage of St. Columba, our patron here at the church. And so the Iona lectures are basically venues by which I ask predominantly PhDs, professors at various locations, to offer lectures out of their own particular discipline. It doesn't have to have necessarily a religious sort of base, but more how do you get out of the ivory tower and give a lecture to to people, just common lay people, right, who are not in your field, and show the impact or importance of what you're doing for society, humanity, the planet, and so forth. And so that's sort of the purpose of those lectures. And last year we had someone from Imperial College in London come and speak. He was in physics, and studying quasars and black holes and all these amazing sort of phenomena. And in that conversation, one of the things that came up is that science itself has to reconceive or understand itself not just as providing facts based on predictable theories, but actually in itself leading to mystery, leading to that which is ultimately unknown, unknowable, unnameable. And the more that we move into particularly the types of sciences that are dealing with the cosmos, this is becoming ever more apparent that there are just some things we can't know. For example, we can't conceive of anything before the Big Bang because it's before space and time, and before space and time, none of our instruments or our mind can conceive or make sense of what that even would be. So we just are led to this place of mystery and awe and unknowing. And in many ways, I think it's a profoundly fruitful time in history for both religious practice and for the sciences to begin a more serious dialogue and less suspicion of each other, because of what each has to offer, this movement toward great mystery. I think Father Keating's great legacy, or one of many, will be the fact that he was able to demonstrate the psychological wisdom of Christian contemplative tradition through modern psychological concepts that wouldn't have existed even 150 years ago, much less 1,000 years ago, and to really cast contemplative practice and the contemplative life through that lens of understanding the psyche and the subconscious and unmet needs and perceptions and so forth, which in my reading of Keating really demonstrated the psychological depth of contemplative traditions, even though the science and the lingo hadn't even existed yet. The concepts and the insights were most certainly there. And so what he did with psychology, others are trying to do with cosmology, and understand spirituality in that light. When the fruit of it is profoundly beautiful. One of my favorite authors in that area is John Polkinghorne. He's an Anglican priest in the Church of England, who has done just amazing work in sort of wedding cosmology and theology together. That's quite insightful.
I was wondering, is the prayer that you wrote, is that posted anywhere so we could see it again?
Yeah, so thanks, Linda. Yes, I think it's coming out in the December newsletter for Contemplative Outreach. If you don't subscribe to that, I'm happy to forward it to you if you just want to go ahead and email me. And you could email me if you just look up St. Columba's, you'll find my email address easily.
Okay.
And just look up St. Columba's in Inverness, California, and you'll find me. And the other thing is, I think once it's posted, you'll be able to go back and see it on the video from today.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
That's true. Didn't think about that. Okay,
thank you.
And if you're able to send me a copy, Father Vincent, I could put it up on our Facebook page as well.
Oh, sure. I'll be happy to do that. Not a problem. Sure.
Thank you. An image that came to me from the reading and the discussion is the evolution from a picture into a mirror, where I'm trying to get rid of all of these fixed things that I believe about who I am and who somebody else is, and gradually become a mirror that reflects the truth. And hopefully, by the grace of God, become more closely a mirror through which people can see God. I think that really struck me, and it was so encouraging to hear. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Robert. It's beautifully said. So I'm aware of our time, and I just want to take us briefly to what I thought might be an exercise worth considering today. So for the week. So let me just call that up again. Okay. So here's my offering or suggestion to you all. So we're in the third week of Advent, right? So each day, this third week of Advent, I encourage you to spend a few minutes reflecting on how your practice has graced you with a capacity to reflect the Imago Dei, or the image of God, in the world. And I invite you to honor each one of these as a moment of birthing Christ in the world, and allow yourself to just move into the gratitude of that birthing in yourself. So I'll just leave that posted there for a moment if anybody's writing that down. So just spend a few minutes reflecting on how your contemplative practice has graced you with the capacity to reflect the image of God in the world, and to honor that and be grateful. Allow yourself to be grateful. Well, I have to say it's wonderful to be back with you all again. And I hope you're having a wonderful Advent and anticipating a lovely holiday upcoming. I look forward to being with you 1 week from today, which is, I believe, the 21st, if I'm not mistaken. And then, as I mentioned, we'll be gone for 1 week on the 28th, and then returning after. So if there's no final questions, or if there are, I'll pause for just a moment, looking around the screen to see if, okay. So I bid you all a very happy week, and again, keep me in prayer. Thank you, Joanne. I appreciate your your note. I'll keep you all in prayer, and I look forward to seeing you a week from today. Okay, so Benum Christinet.
Benum Christinet.
Benum Christinet.
Thank you.
Thank you, Father.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Father Vincent, for taking time to be with us.
Yeah.
Thank you. Happy to do so, Robert.
God bless.
God bless you too. Hi, Sylvia. Hey, Catherine.
Thank you, Father Vincent.
Thank you, Mark. Good to see you again.
So beautiful to be back here in this space with you. It's just so healing.
Thank you. Thanks, Catherine. Yeah, thank you. It's good to see you. And Dwight, I also wanted to mention, I do have your email, and it's a beautiful question you've raised. And I was actually going to suggest if we could maybe even just FaceTime or somehow get on a Zoom session, maybe better for a discussion than a written response about your creation question you had posed way back. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'm seeing little notes come up here. That's why I'm probably looking. It looks to you like I'm looking all over my screen, but I'm trying to locate these little notes that are coming up. Robert, a quick question. Is there another group who's coming on right now?
I don't believe so.
So if we want to stick just for a few minutes, and Dwight, I don't know if you have a couple of minutes. I know it's like I'm pushing it now. It's 3 a.m. for you down there in Tasmania. But if you'd like, and you'd like to have a little conversation about your email, I'm happy to do that now. But if it's a bad time, we can find another.
It's fine by me.
Okay.
It's quiet at home now, so I can spend some time. That's not a problem.
A good time. Okay. As long as some of you are hanging out, then
Yeah.
Dwight, do you mind if I just sort of try to rephrase your question so that people know what I'm trying to address?
Not at all. Go
Okay.
ahead.
And you're welcome to clarify if I'm wrong. So Dwight was basically asking about a comment that was made that he'd already been, I think, reflecting on, but was made by someone here. Her name is Lisa De Silva. She's a cosmologist and a PhD. She's a professor at USF as well, and has spoken here. And in one of her talks or sermons, Dwight observed her talk about the beauty of the universe and a kind of perception of an intelligent design, which, as many of you probably know, is a loaded phrase, really. Intelligent design has often been proffered as a kind of an attempt to intellectualize creationism, really. And I don't think that that's the intent she had behind it, but nevertheless, she used this terminology. And what that raised was a question that Dwight had about how we reconcile certain aspects of creation with the notion that it's intended to be perfect by God. Am I getting that right? So how do you deal?
That's correct.
That's correct. Okay. So how do we begin to grapple with the idea of a very imperfect world that is, by all measure, seeming to evolve? And while Dwight didn't mention this, I'll just throw in, or that, for example, has had 5 periods of mass extinction, right, in which upward of 99% of all species at any given time had been eviscerated, right? Where is the intelligence in that? I think is partly the question. And how are we to discern the goodness of that, of creation, and what God would intend for us in the midst of these seemingly quite imperfect and unintelligible events? So Dwight, I'm going to see. Do you want to add or clarify the question before I try to respond?
No, I think in general terms, you describe exactly what I was trying to express in my email. I'll give you some examples, but we can go without them, I guess.
If you would, just give me an example that, for the sake of those who hadn't been in on the email.
Yes. Well, it relates to a past, I put that way, a past life when I was dealing with tropical diseases. And I was looking at some parasitic conditions such as malaria, for example. How do we reconcile, for example, the Plasmodium vivax and falciparum, and the third one I can't remember anymore, that actually get inoculated in the human body, and through a complex process destroys the red cells and lead these people to a serious anemia and eventually death. And is an ongoing problem, particularly in Africa. So, where's God creation in this? I'm trying to reconcile, because I do believe in God's presence from the beginning. But I've been asked the same question before, and I puzzle myself with that.
Yeah, it's a great question. I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with the Catholic theologian Dennis Edwards. He's actually Australian. He's out of Adelaide. And he wrote a beautiful, he's written many accessible books in the field of Christology. And one of my favorite of his, which is a very brief book, is called, oh goodness, I want to say it's Christ in the Cosmos. I think it's called Christ in the Cosmos. If I'm wrong about that, I'll mention it at our next meeting. It might be Jesus in the Cosmos, actually. But in this book, he tries to talk about creation in much the ways that you are, Dwight. He's really trying to address this situation. And one of the things that I found helpful is that he's trying to draw a balance between what he would call a completely leveling view of creation, by which one would have to, for example, do that absurd thing of valuing the life of a mosquito in equivalent with the life of a child, right? So he says clearly, when you push a leveling view of creation, that all life is sacred, and that there are no distinctions otherwise, he says we reach an untenable conclusion. And we know instinctively, if you're driving down the road and your car starts to careen out of control, and if you go left, you're going to hit a raccoon, and if you go right, you're going to hit a human being, we all know we're going to veer our car to the raccoon. So there is an instinctual, non-leveling view that we hold, a sort of anthropocentric view. And that's what he's arguing for, that it's understandable that we ought to hold what he would call a mild anthropocentrism. Otherwise, you would have to give equal rights to these viruses that you're talking about, and AIDS and diphtheria and all these crazy things, and say, well, they all have a right to live, so we're not going to have any cures for these types of disease. This becomes absurd. So, so in light of that, I certainly agree, Dwight, in your email, that when we're looking at the story of creation, in Genesis, and the other story in Genesis chapter 2, these are clearly in the realm of mythology. We know, for example, in the first story of Genesis, that it's borrowed from an ancient Babylonian myth called the Enuma Elish, which predates it by centuries and was probably encountered by Israel during a period of 40 years in captivity in Babylon. And so we know that there's a pagan sort of polytheistic source that they put into a monotheistic construct. So the starting point, I think, for understanding or modeling creation must be really evolution and not creationism, and not even intelligent design. And we have to understand then that these are primitive myths that are really trying to address non-scientific questions, which now we can't avoid at this point in our history, because we're living in a scientific world where we're seeing things now that we didn't know several hundred years ago. So with that background, my sense is that when we explore the question of an evolutionary universe, and I do talk about this later on in my book, I try to reconcile how we talk about the mythological approach versus the historical approach or evolutionary approach. We have to understand there was never a time that one could argue humanity lived in some perfect paradisical garden or a perfect harmony with God that somehow was cast asunder through, the biting of the fruit and the eating of the forbidden fruit in the case of the Christian and Jewish mythology. So there was never such a time. And therefore, the starting point has to be in the whole universe's struggle to become, starting with the Big Bang and going from energy and condensing into matter. The fascinating question that many people ask is, how is it that the universe came to, let me rephrase that, is the universe geared toward a propensity for hosting life? Does that make sense? That's sort of what's being asked by people. Is it the case that the universe is constantly pushing itself through this evolutionary process toward harboring life in some capacity? Or is this a freak accident, what we call life on Earth? Are we just some freak anomaly that will never happen again and hasn't happened before? Or if so, just rarely and freakishly? And I could see on one hand, from a faith perspective or from a deeply spiritual perspective, beginning with the assumption that here we are now as an instance, that is to say, humanity is an instance in which the universe has the capacity to self-reflect. So it isn't so much that we are other than the universe. We are, as Karl Rahner would say, the universe come to self-consciousness. So, right? We are the universe itself evolving to a point where it can look back in self-understanding at its own reality. That's a beautiful and noble thing. Now, we don't have to assume we're the only instance of that. Many scientists today would assume, in fact, the contrary, that there must be, in the vastness of our universe, multiple, infinite almost number of civilizations potentially with intelligent life. I mean, just that some scientists today are now saying that life is just abundant throughout the universe, but its vastness makes it impossible at this point for us to really discover. But here you see this tremendous, I think, honor, for lack of a better term, given to the process of struggle and the process of becoming. Not, in fact, a perfection that once was and has now become somehow, right, destroyed, right, or messed up, or whatever term, or fractured. And in that, what I see is just simply the tenacity and abundance of life, all struggling to become. And each of us, whether we're what you and I would think of as a disease, that's just another life form that's struggling to become. I mentioned to Dwight in one of the exchanges that I spent time in Tasmania where I, for the first time, got leeches in a hike through some pretty dense forest, and discovered all of a sudden that there were all these black little things all over me, and had to get them off. It was, yeah, it was gross, but but that leech, I presume, in that ecosystem serves a certain purpose and function. And I don't know, Dwight, maybe you could help me with that. Does it? I mean, do we know that if without leeches, would there be a radical shift to the ecosystem in Tasmania?
I really don't know. That's one other question I have. Why do we have these living beings in the world? And my reflection after emailing you was that, similar to what you just mentioned, these are struggling living forms that are trying to become independent. But looking at let's say a more theological view, my own conclusion was that they are also reflections of creation that are evolving in the same way, and maybe in the future we won't have them causing the same type of harm to the human race, to human beings, or any other animals, but live in some kind of harmony. That's my thinking.
And the lion and the lamb shall lay together. It's, I live here in a very rural part of Northern California, and several months ago was on the deck that overlooks a big wooded area here, and was awakened pretty early in the morning, just around dawn, by what was a horrific struggle happening just outside. And I couldn't see it, but what I think it was some kind of like coyote or such killing a very small baby fawn. And it was a long, protracted, agonizing, very disturbing struggle. This fawn was just in agony. It was a terrible thing. And I wanted to try through this driftwood, these chunks of driftwood that I have on the deck, to throw them to break up the fight and try to save this little fawn. But I realized something sacred was happening here, as horrific as it was. And, you know, the speed of the deer and the sharpness of the fangs of the lion, or the you know, the predator, are born of this dance of life and death between the hunter and the hunted, and the faster survive and the sharper teeth get the prey, and that in some very sometimes difficult way, this is how evolution has created the beauty we see, the speed of these animals, and even their ferocity, and the awe we have at their ferocity is a result of these struggles to become throughout history. And that somehow now, in a cosmologically astute sort of world that we live in, one in which we understand our place in evolution, not as humanity against nature, but as humanity as part of nature. I always argue that we have to look at how we model our theology, and clearly we're being called to model theology differently than many centuries who assumed that there was this perfect origin in Eden and has now fractured, and now we're struggling to return to that. So how do we interface these things? So I remember being in Australia, and we were doing zip lines, and they were telling us, yeah, the most toxic plants and animals in the whole world are all in Australia. I thought, how did that happen, that this one continent had so much like venom? And there was this one plant they pointed out that if you brush past it, it ejects what it essentially is poison shards of glass or such into you, and it's quite painful and could last many months of profound discomfort and irritation, very toxic. And part of me thought, why does a plant have to be that violent? Like, what is it about the environment? But this is clearly, I mean, this is the question for me, is knowing what we know now about this adversarial quality in nature, even us trying to overcome diseases and animals brutally, you know, killing each other for meals and so forth. How do we reconceive our image of God in this worldview? And I don't think that resorting to a literalist view of intelligent design is obviously the way to go, but perhaps to ask, is there not something to go back to my request for your spiritual practices week, is there not something about the Imago Dei in the gentleness of the dove as much as the ferocity of, you know, a poisonous serpent, right? Is there not something reflective of the image of God in both of those? I don't know what that is. That's sort of the question that I'm led to. How do we begin to conceive of the divine in all of that? There's another really nice book called Deep Incarnation, which addresses a lot of these issues. In fact, one moment. Here's the book. It's called Deep Incarnation. And it has some really wonderful writers, including the author that I already mentioned, who wrote the book on Jesus and the Cosmos. He's a contributor. And there's some wonderful articles in here which say, if God is to be discovered in all of creation, how do you discover God? I remember one of them asking, in the tsunami. What about the violence in nature that does unspeakable harm to civilization and so forth? Or the wildfires that, you know, are now raging throughout Australia, for example. These are devastating. It's terrifying. And in that sense, I have more of a question. So based on anything I'm saying, I'm wondering if anybody has any thoughts around that, or how we sit with that.
I was in the office of readings today. We're celebrating St. John of the Cross. And he makes a point that none of us can reach that point of peace without suffering. And I can see that as the universe struggles to become, it mirrors my struggle to become. And that makes sense to me because I am part of the universe. So perhaps this utopia that we imagine would actually just be stagnation if we didn't have anything to struggle against. So maybe the struggles are hidden blessings. It just takes time for us to see, or for me to see it as such.
Thank you, Robert. And you're reflecting beautifully that, I'm going to try to locate, on page 59 in the Contemplating Christ, I have a long poem there that I quote from Kazantzakis, who speaks about that struggling to become, and that what he refers to God as the great cry, blowing through heaven and earth, and demanding that we become better than our ancestors. It's a beautiful wedding of the of an evolutionary worldview with an insistence of God who is like a great cry, who summons us beyond ourselves into the whatever's next, and how we constantly resist that becoming. But the beautiful way in which he culminates that in talking about humanity struggling between this animalistic scabbard and this spiritual desire to rise to the great beyond. And I think that there's something to that. The other poem that I cite, because I love so much with D.H. Lawrence's poem on the whole notion of evolution, and I'll be looking at all of this in chapter 2, also speaks to this beautiful idea of a universe that is struggling to become. I wonder what the vision, the prophetic vision of the lion lying with the kid and the child playing in the adder's den, how that speaks to a movement toward something more harmonious, but we're certainly not there in any stretch, by any stretch.
I think I need to reflect a little bit more on what you just said. It's food for thought for me for the next few weeks, I guess. Thank you.
Thanks, Dwight. And it's an ongoing question for me as well. That's why I appreciated you asked it. If you're interested and you didn't catch any of the publications I mentioned, I'm happy to email them to you if you want to just send me a quick email and say, hey, send me some of that literature, because you may find in some of that, a more cogent reflection than I'm offering you today.
Thank you. That's fantastic.
Okay.
I will.
And this talk, as well as all of the other talks from Father Vincent, are available on our website, Dwight, so you can always go there and review it.
Thanks.
Thank you, Robert.
Thanks, Robert.
You're welcome.
Well, thank you all. I hope you all have a wonderful week, and I look forward to seeing you again next Saturday.
Thank you so much for being with us. God bless you.
God bless you too.
Thank you again.
Thank you.
You're
That was
welcome.
so interesting. I've been thinking about the same thing. Although not as in elegant terms as you two.
Well, I hardly felt elegant this morning, but as we get to chapter 2, we will be talking about that, and you'll see that doesn't. That's it's a real necessary question to be asking if we're
Yeah.
serious about, you know, doing spirituality in the modern world. That's a great question. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. Thanks, guys. Have a good one. Bye-bye. Ciao.